Hello, dear listeners. Welcome to the English Globe. Today we begin an episode that many people around the world are quietly thinking about, searching for online, and discussing in serious conversations, yet often without clear explanations or reliable context, which is why confusion spreads so quickly. The topic we are exploring today is known as the Epstein Files, a phrase that has appeared in global news headlines, court discussions, and public debates, not because of rumors or entertainment, but because official documents and legal records have become part of public conversation, raising important questions about transparency, justice, and how information is shared with society in a responsible and educational way.
Yes, Adam, and I completely agree with you, because many listeners feel uncertain when they hear this topic mentioned, especially English learners who may struggle to understand complex news language and legal terms. That is why, from the very beginning, we want to reassure everyone listening that this episode is designed to be calm, respectful, and educational, focusing only on publicly discussed information and legal processes, not speculation or emotional storytelling. Our goal is to help listeners feel confident while learning English through serious world topics, instead of feeling overwhelmed or worried by dramatic headlines they see online.
That reassurance is very important, Julia, because when people hear about documents connected to courts or investigations, they often imagine secret truths or shocking discoveries, even when the reality is much more structured and procedural. In fact, many of these discussions exist because legal systems sometimes release records to the public as part of transparency, which allows journalists, researchers, and citizens to examine how justice systems function. This global attention shows how deeply people care about accountability and fairness, and understanding this process calmly helps us become more informed, responsible readers and listeners of international news.
Exactly, Adam. And this is where English learning becomes deeply connected to critical thinking, because understanding the language of news requires more than vocabulary alone. Listeners must learn how to separate facts from opinions, documents from conclusions, and official records from online interpretations. By listening to this episode, learners are not only practicing their English listening skills, but also learning how to approach serious topics thoughtfully, without rushing to judgment. This is a valuable life skill, especially in a digital world where information travels faster than careful explanation.
You are absolutely right, Julia, and that is why today's discussion matters beyond just one name or one set of documents. It reflects a much larger issue about how societies balance public interest with legal responsibility, and how courts decide what information can be shared openly. When people around the world talk about these files, they are often really talking about trust, transparency, and the role of institutions in protecting justice. Understanding these ideas in simple English allows learners to participate in global conversations with clarity and confidence, rather than fear or misunderstanding.
And I would add, Adam, that many people feel overwhelmed because social media often presents information without context, which can make serious topics feel confusing or emotionally heavy. That is why here at the English Globe, we slow everything down and explain each idea step by step, using clear language and a calm tone. This episode is meant to guide listeners gently, showing that even complex legal discussions can be understood when explained carefully, without sensational language or unnecessary details that distract from learning.
That careful approach is exactly what we aim for, Julia, because this podcast is first and foremost an educational space. Today's episode is not about making claims or accusations, but about understanding how public documents become part of global discussion and why people care so deeply about them. We want listeners to walk away with stronger English skills and a clearer understanding of how legal transparency works, rather than emotional reactions shaped by incomplete information. Learning through real-world topics makes English more meaningful and connected to everyday global conversations.
I completely agree, Adam. And before we continue, we would love to invite our dear listeners to support this educational journey with us. If you find this kind of calm, clear explanation helpful for improving your English and understanding world events, please like this video and subscribe to the English Globe, because your support helps us continue creating free, educational content for learners everywhere. Each like and subscription tells us that this learning-focused approach truly makes a difference.
And we would also love to hear from you directly, because language learning becomes stronger when it is shared. Please take a moment to tell us in the comments where you are listening from today, whether it is from your home, your workplace, or during travel, and feel free to share your thoughts about today's topic in a respectful and thoughtful way. Hearing from learners around the world reminds us that English is a global bridge connecting different perspectives and experiences.
Yes, Adam, and remember, dear listeners, this space is about learning, not judging, and understanding, not reacting emotionally. As we move forward in this episode, we encourage you to stay curious, stay calm, and listen carefully, focusing on how the language is used to explain serious ideas clearly. By doing this, you will not only understand today's topic better, but you will also strengthen your ability to follow international news confidently in English.
So with that mindset, Julia, and with our listeners ready to learn, we will now begin exploring this topic step by step, focusing on facts, legal context, and public discussion, always keeping our educational purpose clear. This journey is about clarity, responsibility, and language growth, and we are glad to have you with us as we continue right here on the English Globe. To understand why the Epstein Files are discussed so widely today, it is important to first understand who Jeffrey Epstein was, based only on publicly available and factual information. Jeffrey Epstein was an American financier who became known in elite social and financial circles, particularly from the 1990s onward. He presented himself as a wealthy businessman involved in money management and advisory services, and over time, his name appeared in connection with influential individuals, private events, and high-profile locations. At this stage, it is important to focus only on his public background, without assumptions, because understanding the person helps learners understand why legal attention later followed.
Yes, Adam, and for English learners, the word financier simply means someone who works with money, investments, or financial services, often for wealthy clients or organizations. Epstein was not a traditional public figure like a politician or actor, but he became visible because of the circles he moved in and the lifestyle he appeared to live. This visibility is one reason why many people later became interested in his background. Understanding these basic terms helps listeners follow international news more confidently, especially when financial and legal vocabulary is involved.
During his early career, Epstein worked in education and finance, gradually building connections that increased his social status. Over time, he became known for owning multiple properties, including homes in the United States and abroad, which contributed to his public image as a wealthy individual. His lifestyle attracted media attention, not because of confirmed wrongdoing at first, but because of the contrast between his private business activities and his very public associations. This difference between professional background and public image is something that often appears in complex news stories.
That is an important point, Adam, because many learners assume that public attention always begins with legal problems, but in reality, it often begins with curiosity about power, wealth, and influence. When news reports describe someone's public profile, they are referring to how a person is seen by society, not necessarily what has been legally proven. This distinction is essential for understanding serious topics calmly, without emotional reactions, especially when learning English through global news stories.
As time passed, Epstein became the subject of legal investigation related to alleged misconduct, which marked a turning point in how he was viewed by authorities and the public. It is important to state clearly that investigations follow legal procedures, and being investigated does not mean that every claim is automatically proven. Legal systems are designed to examine evidence, hear testimony, and follow strict rules before reaching conclusions. This process is slow and detailed, which is why cases connected to legal investigations often remain in the public discussion for many years.
Exactly, Adam. And this is where learners may encounter new vocabulary, such as investigation, charges, or legal process, which can sound confusing at first. An investigation simply means that authorities are looking into possible violations of the law to understand what happened. It does not mean that decisions have already been made. By understanding this language, listeners can follow serious news stories without misunderstanding headlines that sometimes sound stronger than the facts actually support.
In Epstein's case, legal attention increased because authorities were examining allegations that involved serious legal concerns. These investigations brought his name into court systems and official records, which is why documents connected to him later became part of public discussion. Again, for educational clarity, our focus here is not on specific allegations, but on explaining how someone moved from being a private businessman to a person whose name appears frequently in legal and media contexts. This transition is key to understanding why documents exist at all.
Yes, and learners should remember that legal records often include many types of information, such as statements, references, or procedural details, which do not always lead to final judgments. This is why understanding the difference between being mentioned and being legally decided is so important. For English learners especially, learning this distinction helps avoid confusion when reading or listening to international news, where language can feel formal or indirect.
Another important part of Epstein's public background is that his case involved multiple jurisdictions, meaning more than one legal authority over time. When a case crosses regions or institutions, it often becomes more complex, leading to longer investigations and more documentation. This complexity is one reason why people around the world still talk about the case today, as legal systems continue to manage records, requests, and transparency issues related to past proceedings.
That complexity can feel overwhelming, Adam. But this is why educational explanations matter. When we break down events into timelines and simple language, learners can follow the story without feeling lost. Understanding how legal systems work in general, even without focusing on sensitive details, helps listeners develop stronger comprehension skills. This episode aims to build that understanding gradually, so learners feel more confident engaging with serious topics in English.
To summarize this background clearly, Jeffrey Epstein was a businessman whose wealth and social connections placed him in the public eye, and later, legal investigations brought his name into official court records. These records are the foundation for many discussions today, not rumors or opinions. By focusing on factual background and legal structure, we help listeners understand why documents exist and why they are discussed, without creating confusion or emotional reactions.
And that summary is very helpful, Adam, because it reminds listeners that learning English through world topics is not about judgment, but about understanding systems, language, and context. By listening carefully and focusing on clear explanations, learners improve their ability to understand serious news stories with confidence and calmness. As we continue, we will keep explaining each part, step by step, always keeping our educational purpose clear here on the English Globe.
To move forward clearly in this discussion, it is very important to explain what people actually mean when they say the Epstein Files, because this phrase can sound mysterious or dramatic, even though it refers to something quite structured and legal in nature. In simple terms, the Epstein Files are not one single book or secret report, but a collection of court-related documents connected to legal cases, investigations, and civil proceedings that involved Jeffrey Epstein over time. These documents exist because courts record information carefully, and when certain records are unsealed or released, They become available for journalists, researchers, and the public to read and discuss.
Yes, Adam. And for English learners, the word files here simply means official papers or records, not personal opinions or final answers. Many listeners may imagine hidden secrets, but in reality, court files usually include things like legal motions, transcripts, written statements, and procedural documents. These records are often written in formal legal English, which can feel confusing or intimidating. So our goal today is to help learners understand what these documents are meant to do, rather than what people online sometimes claim they mean.
Another key point to understand is that many of these documents were created years ago but were not fully public at the time, which is why people sometimes describe them as newly released or unsealed. In legal systems, some records are sealed to protect privacy, ongoing investigations, or legal fairness, and later, a judge may decide that certain parts can be made public. This process is normal in many countries and does not mean something sudden or hidden has been discovered, but rather that the legal timeline has reached a stage where transparency is allowed.
That explanation is very important, Adam, because learners often misunderstand the word sealed, thinking it means secret forever, when it usually means temporarily closed to the public. When a document becomes unsealed, it simply becomes readable, not necessarily proven or confirmed. This is why English learners should be careful when reading headlines that suggest documents reveal final truths, because legal language is often cautious and incomplete until cases fully end. Learning this helps listeners become more confident and responsible newsreaders.
Exactly, Julia. And this brings us to one of the most important ideas in this episode, which is the difference between documents and conclusions. A document can contain names, references, or statements, but that does not mean the document is making a judgment. Courts collect information as part of a process, and many documents exist only to record what was said, requested, or filed at a certain time. Understanding this difference helps people avoid jumping to conclusions based on incomplete or misunderstood information.
I agree completely, Adam, because for English learners, it is essential to understand that legal documents often reflect questions, not answers. Words like alleged, mentioned, or referenced appear frequently, and these words are signals that the information is part of a process, not a final decision. By paying attention to this language, learners can better understand serious news stories and avoid confusion caused by emotional or misleading reporting, especially on social media platforms.
When people talk about the Epstein Files in public discussions, they are usually referring to a group of documents connected to civil lawsuits, criminal investigations, or related legal actions, not a single official report. These documents may include testimonies, filings by lawyers, or court orders, all of which serve different purposes in the legal system. None of these documents alone decide guilt or innocence, because that responsibility belongs only to courts after full legal review, which is why responsible discussions must remain careful and factual.
That careful approach is especially important for learners, Adam, because English news reporting often summarizes complex legal material into short headlines. These headlines may attract attention, but leave out important context, which can lead to misunderstanding. We encourage listeners to slow down, look for reliable sources, and remember that documents are part of a larger, legal conversation. This habit not only improves English comprehension, but also builds strong critical thinking skills that are useful in everyday life.
Another helpful way to think about legal files is to imagine them as pieces of a puzzle rather than a finished picture. Each document shows a small part of a process, such as a legal request, a response, or a procedural decision. Without seeing the full legal context, it is impossible to understand the complete meaning. That is why this episode focuses on explaining the structure of these files rather than interpreting them emotionally, helping listeners understand how legal transparency works in general.
Yes, and this is exactly why educational content like this matters, because it teaches learners how to engage with difficult topics responsibly. Instead of reacting quickly to online claims, listeners can learn to ask calm questions, such as what type of document is this, why was it created, and what does it legally represent? These questions help learners grow not only in English, but also in confidence when discussing global news topics with others.
So, to summarize this section clearly, the term Epstein Files refers to a collection of legal and court-related documents that became part of public discussion through legal processes. These files record information, procedures, and statements, but they do not automatically prove conclusions or judgments. Understanding this difference allows listeners to follow serious news calmly and accurately, which is essential for both language learning and responsible global awareness.
And that summary perfectly supports our goal, Adam, because learning English through real-world topics works best when clarity comes before emotion. As we continue this episode, we will keep explaining each idea step by step, helping listeners understand not just this topic, but how legal and media language works more broadly. This way, English learners can feel informed, confident, and calm as they continue listening here on the English Globe.
To understand why these documents were released, it is important to first understand how courts work in general, because courts do not release information randomly or emotionally, but through structured legal decisions made over time. In many legal systems, documents are created during investigations, lawsuits, or hearings, and some of these records are temporarily kept private to protect fairness, safety, or ongoing legal work. Later, when judges decide that releasing certain information will not harm the legal process, those records may become public, which is often described as documents being unsealed.
Yes, Adam. And for English learners, the word unsealed can sound dramatic, but it simply means that a document is no longer closed to the public. Courts often seal documents at first to make sure investigations are fair and that people's rights are protected. When the situation changes, such as when a case is closed or when privacy risks are reduced, judges may allow parts of those records to be read by the public. This does not mean something new has happened, but that the legal process has reached a different stage.
That is an important clarification, Julia, because many people think documents are released because of pressure or public excitement, when in reality, courts follow legal standards and procedures. Judges consider laws related to transparency, which means allowing the public to see how the justice system operates, while also respecting laws that protect personal privacy. This balance is difficult, and that is why decisions about releasing documents often take years, not days. The timing reflects careful review, not sudden discovery.
Exactly, Adam. And learners should understand that transparency laws exist to build trust between the public and legal institutions. These laws allow citizens, journalists, and researchers to understand how decisions are made without revealing unnecessary or harmful details. For English learners, this is a great opportunity to learn words like transparency, privacy, and judicial review, which appear frequently in international news. Understanding these terms helps listeners follow serious discussions calmly, instead of feeling confused by legal language.
Another reason documents may be released is public interest, which means that courts recognize a strong public desire to understand how justice systems handle important cases. Public interest does not mean curiosity or entertainment, but the need for transparency in matters that affect trust in institutions. Judges must carefully decide what serves the public good while still respecting legal boundaries. This careful decision-making is why documents are often released in parts, with sensitive sections removed or protected.
That careful balance is very important, Adam, because privacy laws exist to protect individuals from unnecessary harm or exposure. Even when documents are released, courts may remove names, details, or sections to make sure privacy is respected. For learners, this shows that legal systems try to be fair to everyone involved. Understanding this process helps listeners avoid extreme interpretations they might see online and instead appreciate how complex legal responsibility really is.
It is also helpful to understand that many of these documents were already known to exist long before they were released. Lawyers, judges, and court staff work with these records regularly, but the public does not always have access immediately. When access is later allowed, it can feel sudden to the public, even though the documents themselves are not new. This difference between public awareness and legal timelines explains why people often feel surprised when documents become available.
Yes, and that difference can be confusing for English learners, especially when headlines suggest that something shocking has just happened. In reality, what often happens is that a legal door opens slowly, allowing people to see information that was already part of the system. This is why we encourage listeners to read news carefully and understand that legal processes move at a very different speed than social media conversations. Learning this helps reduce stress and misunderstanding when following global news.
Courts also consider whether releasing documents could affect future cases or legal precedents, which are examples that influence how future decisions are made. Judges must think not only about the present moment, but about how their decisions might be used later. This responsibility is another reason why courts act cautiously and take time before unsealing records. These decisions reflect legal reasoning, not emotional reaction, which is an important lesson for anyone learning about justice systems.
That long-term thinking is a valuable concept for learners, Adam, because it shows how law is connected to stability and fairness. When listeners understand that courts think carefully about consequences, they can better understand why transparency does not mean complete openness at all times. This understanding also helps learners practice patience and critical thinking, which are important skills when reading complex English texts related to law and politics.
So when people ask why these documents were released now, the answer is usually connected to legal timing, judicial review, and decisions about public interest and privacy. Documents are released because the law allows it at a certain moment, not because of rumors or public pressure alone. This perspective helps listeners understand the system rather than react emotionally to headlines, which is especially important when learning English through serious global topics.
And that explanation supports our educational purpose perfectly, Adam, because it shows listeners that understanding legal processes requires calm thinking and clear language. By learning how courts decide when to release documents, English learners gain confidence in understanding international news and legal discussions. As we continue this episode, we will keep explaining each part step by step, always focusing on clarity, responsibility, and language learning here on the English Globe.
At this point in our discussion, it becomes extremely important to slow down and clearly explain what these files actually contain, because this is where misunderstandings often begin. Many people hear that names appear in documents and immediately assume that those names represent guilt or wrongdoing, which is not how legal records work. In legal systems, documents are created to record information, questions, statements, and procedures, not to deliver final judgments. A name appearing in a file may simply reflect contact, reference, or context, and it does not automatically mean involvement in illegal activity.
I agree completely, Adam. And this is a critical lesson for English learners who follow international news. When learners see headlines that say someone was named in documents, they may believe this means something has been proven, when in reality, legal language is much more careful and limited. A document can include many names because it records what was said by someone else, what was discussed in a legal setting, or what was referenced during a process. Understanding this difference helps learners avoid emotional reactions and focus instead on how information is actually presented in law.
Another key element of these files is testimony, which is a word that often causes confusion. Testimony simply means a statement given by a person during a legal process, such as a court case or investigation. Testimony is not the same as a verified fact, because it represents one person's account, not a final conclusion reached by a judge. Courts collect testimony so they can examine, compare, and evaluate information carefully, which is why testimony alone never decides guilt or innocence.
That explanation is very helpful, Adam, because many learners think testimony means truth, when it actually means perspective. In English news reports, testimony is often quoted to explain what someone said at a certain time, not to prove what happened. This is why learners should pay close attention to words like said, claimed, or described, which signal that the information comes from a statement, not a judgment. Learning to recognize these signals improves both language skills and critical reading ability.
The files also contain references, which are mentions of people, places, or events that help explain context within a legal discussion. A reference does not suggest responsibility or guilt, but simply helps document relationships or timelines. Legal records must be detailed so courts can understand complex situations, and that means many names and events may appear even when they are not central to a legal decision. This is one of the main reasons why reading documents without context can easily lead to misunderstanding.
Yes, Adam. And this is exactly why context matters so much, especially for English learners who may only read short summaries online. When people read isolated sentences or social media posts without background explanation, they can misunderstand what a document is actually saying. Context includes when the document was written, why it was written, and how it fits into a larger legal process. Teaching learners to look for this context helps them become more confident and responsible consumers of news.
Media responsibility also plays a major role here because journalists decide how to summarize complex legal documents for the public. Responsible media outlets explain that documents record information rather than prove conclusions, while less careful reporting may focus on dramatic language to attract attention. This difference affects how people understand serious topics, which is why it is so important to approach news calmly and thoughtfully. Documents provide information, but interpretation must be careful and accurate.
That media role is very important for learners to understand, Adam, because headlines are designed to be short and eye-catching, not detailed or educational. A headline may highlight one part of a document while ignoring the full explanation, which can create a misleading impression. This does not always mean the headline is false, but it often means it is incomplete. Learners should use headlines as a starting point, not a final understanding, and look for full explanations when possible.
Another important idea to remember is that legal language is intentionally cautious. Words like alleged, reported, or according to documents are used to avoid making claims that have not been proven in court. This careful language protects fairness and accuracy, even though it can sound indirect or confusing. Understanding this style of writing helps learners read serious news with patience and clarity, instead of frustration or fear.
Exactly, Adam. And for English learners, this cautious language can actually be helpful once they learn to recognize it. These words are signals that information is part of a process, not a conclusion. When learners notice this, they can slow down, think critically, and ask whether a statement reflects evidence, opinion, or legal procedure. This habit strengthens both language comprehension and logical thinking, which are essential skills in today's information-rich world.
So when people ask what the files actually contain, the most accurate answer is that they contain records of legal processes, including statements, references, and procedural details. They do not contain verdicts or final judgments unless a court has officially issued one. Understanding this difference helps prevent misinformation and emotional reactions, allowing people to focus on facts rather than assumptions. This approach is especially important when learning English through sensitive global topics.
And that understanding supports our educational mission perfectly, Adam, because learning English is not just about grammar or vocabulary, but about learning how meaning is created in real-world communication. By teaching learners how to read legal and media language critically, we help them become more confident listeners and readers. As we continue this episode, we will keep emphasizing clarity, responsibility, and context, so learners can grow both linguistically and intellectually here on the English globe.
When discussing the Epstein Files, it is crucial to examine how media outlets reported on them, because the way information is presented can shape public understanding dramatically. Different media organizations have varying styles, purposes, and levels of responsibility. Some focus on careful reporting, providing context, quoting directly from documents, and explaining the difference between claims, testimony, and proven facts. These outlets often include explanations for readers about legal terms, timelines, and the process behind the release of files, helping audiences understand complex topics without jumping to conclusions or spreading misinformation.
Yes, Adam, and this is where English learners can gain valuable skills. By observing how responsible journalism presents facts clearly and with context, learners can see examples of professional tone, careful wording, and logical organization. Words such as reported, stated, according to documents, and allegedly are common in such reporting and serve a protective and clarifying purpose. Understanding these words helps learners read and listen to news more accurately. It also teaches them to notice when an article is providing context rather than drawing conclusions, which is essential for critical thinking.
In contrast, some media outlets prioritize attention-grabbing headlines and dramatic summaries. While these headlines may attract clicks, they often condense complex legal documents into short phrases that can appear more sensational than factual. For example, a headline might emphasize a name mentioned in a document without clarifying that mention does not imply guilt or proven involvement. This is why people sometimes develop misunderstandings about what the Epstein Files actually reveal. Responsible news consumption involves recognizing the difference between headlines designed to attract attention and the full story that carefully presents verified information.
Exactly, Adam. And learners should be aware that emotional language in news is often used to provoke a response rather than to educate. Phrases like shocking revelation or explosive documents are meant to engage readers' emotions, not provide clarity. For English learners, noticing this tone is as important as understanding vocabulary. By identifying the writer's tone, learners can evaluate whether the article is trying to inform or to create a reaction. This skill strengthens both language comprehension and media literacy, allowing learners to remain calm and analytical when encountering complex stories.
Social media adds another layer to public reaction. Platforms like Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram allow people to share summaries, opinions, or interpretations instantly. While this rapid sharing can spread awareness quickly, it also increases the risk of misinformation. Posts often omit context, exaggerate certain aspects, or mix facts with assumptions. Observing these patterns helps learners understand how content is shaped by platform incentives and audience behavior, highlighting the importance of cross-checking information with reliable sources before forming an opinion.
That is a very important observation, Adam, because learners may feel overwhelmed when encountering conflicting information online. By examining multiple perspectives, readers can detect biases, repeated claims, or exaggerated language. For example, if several posts repeat the same dramatic phrasing without reference to documents or verified sources, it is likely that the posts are amplifying each other, rather than providing new factual information. Recognizing these patterns allows learners to filter information, focus on reliable content, and avoid emotional overreactions.
Responsible journalism often provides context about why names are mentioned in documents, the difference between statements and conclusions, and the legal and procedural backdrop of the case. Sensational media, however, frequently omits these distinctions, which can mislead readers or create unnecessary panic. By comparing different sources, audiences learn to identify responsible reporting. For English learners, this comparison is an opportunity to practice reading comprehension, critical analysis, and vocabulary development, because it involves noticing nuanced differences in tone, phrasing, and structure across multiple articles.
Yes, Adam, and learners can also practice identifying bias. Bias may appear through repeated adjectives, selective quoting, or emotional framing. For example, a sentence that emphasizes scandal or explosive is framing information to provoke a reaction, whereas a factual sentence might say, "The documents contain statements submitted to the court in 2019. By distinguishing these differences, learners gain both language skills and the ability to think critically about information. This practice strengthens understanding and prevents misinterpretation of complex news topics.
It is also worth noting that public reaction to media reporting is influenced by cultural, social, and political factors. Different regions may interpret the same news differently, and social media often amplifies these interpretations. Observing this phenomenon helps learners understand that information is not received in isolation. Responsible media reports aim to provide clarity across different audiences, explaining context and using neutral language, while sensationalized content often emphasizes the dramatic elements, which can mislead readers unfamiliar with legal processes or careful reasoning.
Exactly, Adam. And learners should use this knowledge to remain calm and deliberate when reading or listening to news. Critical consumption includes asking questions such as, who wrote this? What evidence is presented? What words indicate opinion versus fact? By practicing this approach, learners improve not only English skills, but also reasoning and analytical abilities. The ability to distinguish between emotional reporting and factual explanation is an essential life skill, particularly in a world where news travels faster than verification processes.
Finally, it is essential to remember that both responsible journalism and social media reactions influence how the public perceives complex legal stories. Responsible reporting educates, clarifies, and explains context, whereas sensational coverage often confuses, exaggerates, or omits important distinctions. By observing these differences, learners can make informed decisions about which sources to trust, how to read headlines critically, and how to engage with news without becoming overwhelmed or misled. These skills are especially important for English learners, as they develop both language and media literacy simultaneously.
Yes, Adam, and as we continue to explore the Epstein Files in this educational podcast, our goal is to help listeners understand how context, tone, and responsible reporting shape comprehension. By learning to identify bias, notice sensational phrasing, and focus on verified facts, learners can remain calm, analytical, and confident in their understanding. This section demonstrates that English learning goes beyond vocabulary or grammar. It includes the ability to interpret complex global information thoughtfully, responsibly, and safely here on the English globe.
As we continue our discussion on the Epstein Files, it is very important to understand the difference between what courts officially decide and what circulates on the Internet. Legal rulings come from careful review, evaluation of evidence, and formal procedures. They are slow because judges, lawyers, and investigators must follow strict rules to ensure fairness. In contrast, online claims often spread quickly, sometimes without verification, and may present assumptions or opinions as if they were proven facts. Recognizing this distinction is essential for anyone trying to understand serious topics responsibly.
Absolutely, Adam. For English learners, this distinction is especially valuable because online content can appear persuasive, even when it is not factual. Words like rumor, alleged, or reported often signal unverified information. By learning to pay attention to these cues, listeners can separate speculation from verified statements. This habit helps learners avoid repeating claims that may be inaccurate, which is important not only for language practice, but also for maintaining credibility when discussing news with others or practicing English conversation.
Courts move slowly because legal systems prioritize accuracy over speed. Every document, statement, and piece of evidence must be examined carefully before a decision can be made. This process ensures that judgments are based on verified information and not public opinion, rumors, or pressure. Many people expect quick answers, especially with high-profile cases, but the slow pace is a safeguard for justice. Understanding this helps listeners appreciate that a lack of immediate conclusions does not mean inactivity or secrecy. It is a reflection of methodical and responsible legal procedure.
Yes, and learners should remember that this slow process can feel frustrating, especially when social media spreads fast updates or incomplete information. By comparing the speed of online posts with the deliberate pace of legal systems, learners can understand why it is important to remain patient and cautious. Critical reading skills are essential here. Asking questions such as, "Has this been verified by a court?" or "What is the source of this claim?" helps learners identify reliable information while practicing English comprehension and logical reasoning at the same time.
Another key idea is the importance of evidence. Courts rely on documented evidence, such as sworn testimony, official filings, and corroborating records. Evidence must be examined carefully for authenticity, relevance, and reliability. This is why even when multiple statements or claims exist online, they are not automatically treated as true in a legal context. Legal standards require proof that meets specific criteria before decisions can be made. Understanding this concept is essential for learners because it shows how the justice system protects fairness and prevents judgments based on rumors or unverified information.
Exactly, Adam. Many online claims may sound convincing because they repeat quickly or come from multiple sources, but repetition does not equal truth. Learners should notice the difference between information backed by evidence and speculation repeated for attention. Developing this skill strengthens both English comprehension and critical thinking. When learners practice evaluating sources, identifying supporting evidence, and recognizing cautious language, they gain confidence in understanding news in a calm, responsible way.
Courts also differentiate between allegations and proven facts. Allegations are claims that someone may have made, which must be investigated before any conclusions are drawn. Legal judgments are reached only after careful examination of evidence and following procedural rules. This distinction is often lost in online discussions, where claims are presented as fact without supporting evidence. Recognizing this difference is fundamental to understanding serious topics and protects learners from accepting misleading information or sharing it unintentionally.
Yes, Adam. English learners should also practice noting signal words in news or social media posts. Words like alleged, claimed, according to sources, or reported indicate that the information is not yet verified. This linguistic awareness helps learners interpret content more accurately and avoid spreading misinformation themselves. By understanding the cautious style of verified reporting versus speculative online content, learners can engage with serious topics safely, improving both language and judgment skills.
It is also worth mentioning that courts aim for impartiality, which means they do not respond to online pressure, public outrage, or media frenzy. Their primary responsibility is to examine facts carefully and apply the law consistently. This principle ensures fairness for all parties involved. By understanding this, listeners can appreciate why legal processes often take time and why immediate online reactions may not reflect legal reality. The justice system operates under rules designed to prevent errors and protect both the public and individuals involved.
This is a very useful point, Adam, because learners sometimes feel that online discussions provide the full picture. But in reality, these discussions often highlight only parts of a case without context. By learning to distinguish between procedural reality and internet speculation, listeners gain both English comprehension and practical reasoning skills. Critical reading becomes a tool for staying calm, making informed judgments, and engaging thoughtfully with information, which is exactly what we aim to teach in this podcast.
Finally, learners should understand that legal reality is built on documents, evidence, and verified testimony, while internet claims may be incomplete, exaggerated, or incorrect. Following this principle helps prevent misunderstanding and protects learners from spreading unverified statements. It also encourages patience, careful analysis, and confidence in assessing serious topics in English. Learning to compare verified legal information with online speculation develops both language skills and responsible media literacy.
Yes, Adam. To summarize, learners should remember 3 key points. First, court rulings are based on evidence and legal standards, not on rapid online reactions. Second, courts move slowly because accuracy and fairness are prioritized over speed. Third, online claims must always be checked against reliable sources before they are believed or shared. By practicing these habits, English learners strengthen vocabulary, comprehension, and critical thinking, allowing them to engage with global news responsibly and safely.
This understanding of legal reality versus online claims is essential for anyone trying to learn English through current events. It allows listeners to remain calm, thoughtful, and analytical, even when topics are complex or widely discussed. By focusing on verified information, evidence, and procedural details, learners gain skills in reading, listening, and interpreting serious news. This is exactly the approach we want to reinforce here at the English Globe, where education, clarity, and language learning come first.
Exactly, Adam. By distinguishing legal reality from speculation, learners not only improve English comprehension, but also develop the ability to think critically about information they encounter daily. Recognizing the difference between verified facts and unverified claims prevents misunderstandings, reduces stress, and encourages responsible communication. As we continue exploring the Epstein Files, we will keep applying this careful, educational approach to every topic, helping learners build confidence and skill in English while understanding global issues accurately.
As we continue, it is important to recognize that the Epstein Files are not only significant locally, but they also raise issues that affect people worldwide. When legal processes, transparency, and accountability are discussed in the public sphere, they resonate far beyond any single case. Observers in different countries often examine this situation as an example of how justice systems operate, how powerful individuals are held accountable, and how transparency, or the lack of it, affects public trust. By looking at it from a global perspective, learners can see that these topics matter to everyone, not just the people directly involved.
Yes, Adam. For English learners, understanding this connection helps show why news is not just local information. Transparency means that governments, courts, and institutions provide information that can be checked and understood by the public. When transparency is present, people are more likely to trust legal systems and leaders. Without transparency, rumors, misinformation, and speculation often fill the gaps. By learning these concepts, listeners not only improve their vocabulary, such as accountability and oversight, but also gain a better understanding of how civic systems operate globally.
Another global aspect of this case is its relationship with justice systems in general. Legal systems exist to protect fairness, rights, and evidence-based decision-making. The Epstein Files illustrate the importance of due process, showing how courts carefully evaluate evidence before issuing judgments. Around the world, countries have similar processes that balance public interest with individual rights. By studying this case, learners can better understand the principles that underpin legal systems internationally, such as impartiality, fairness, and thorough examination of facts.
Exactly, Adam. And this is why civic awareness is such a crucial lesson here. English learners can benefit from seeing how legal principles like transparency and due process influence public trust. When people understand these principles, they are better prepared to engage responsibly with news, discussions, and civic activities. Even without direct involvement, knowledge of these systems teaches listeners how accountability works, why evidence is important, and how societies attempt to prevent misuse of power. These lessons are both language building and life building.
In addition, the Epstein Files highlight the relationship between power, influence, and the law. Cases like this attract attention because they show that no matter someone's social, economic, or political position, legal systems exist to investigate and, when appropriate, hold individuals accountable. Globally, this idea resonates with audiences concerned about fairness, equality before the law, and ethical governance. It also reinforces the principle that information, transparency, and procedural integrity are critical for maintaining public confidence in justice systems everywhere.
Yes, and for learners, this connection to ethics and civic responsibility is very meaningful. Words like accountability, oversight, and integrity may appear challenging at first, but understanding their use in global contexts helps listeners expand both vocabulary and comprehension. By seeing how these concepts apply in real-world situations, learners can make links between language, global awareness, and critical thinking. This strengthens English skills while helping learners understand why societies value transparency and justice.
Another global lesson from this case involves the media's role in educating the public. Across countries, media organizations report on transparency, legal processes, and accountability differently. Responsible reporting helps citizens understand what is happening, provides context, and highlights the importance of evidence. Sensationalized reporting, on the other hand, can create misunderstanding and distrust. Observing these differences in media coverage helps learners not only improve English comprehension, but also develop critical thinking skills that are valuable when interpreting international news.
Absolutely, Adam. For learners, understanding the global impact also encourages responsible information consumption. By analyzing how different countries, courts, and media handle similar situations, listeners learn to compare approaches and think critically about governance, justice, and fairness. This is particularly useful for English learners because it links language practice with practical reasoning, helping them develop skills to read, listen, and discuss complex topics calmly and accurately.
The Epstein Files also serve as an example of how global audiences can respond to transparency. When documents are released or legal processes are highlighted internationally, people in different regions discuss, analyze, and learn from them. This creates a shared learning experience about the role of law, fairness, and accountability. For learners, it is a demonstration of how language and information connect worldwide, showing that careful, evidence-based understanding is valued across borders.
Yes, and this perspective also teaches learners the value of civic engagement. Even if someone is not directly involved in legal systems, understanding transparency and accountability allows them to make informed decisions, whether in conversations, voting, or public debates. Learning the language to express ideas about power, justice, and civic responsibility also empowers learners to communicate effectively in English, connecting global knowledge with practical skills for personal development.
Finally, considering the Epstein Files globally reminds us that transparency, accountability, and evidence-based justice are universal principles. No matter the country or culture, These principles help societies function fairly. By understanding this case calmly and critically, listeners can see patterns that apply to international law, media coverage, and public engagement. This reinforces the idea that language learning and global awareness go hand in hand, allowing English learners to comprehend serious topics responsibly while improving vocabulary and comprehension skills.
Exactly, Adam. The global importance of this case teaches listeners that civic education, critical thinking, and careful attention to information are as important as language skills. By focusing on transparency, justice, and accountability, learners see why these concepts matter internationally and why understanding them strengthens communication, reasoning, and cultural awareness. As English learners, practicing these skills helps develop confidence in reading, listening, and discussing complex global topics safely and effectively.
So, to summarize this section, the Epstein Files matter globally because they connect to the bigger themes of transparency, justice, accountability, and civic awareness. They provide an example of how legal systems, media, and public attention intersect worldwide. Understanding these connections helps listeners comprehend why information is shared, how accountability is maintained, and why legal principles are essential in any society. Observing this case from a global perspective reinforces both education and responsible English learning.
Yes. And this summary reminds learners that language practice is enhanced when connected to real-world global issues. By exploring transparency, fairness, and civic responsibility, listeners not only improve vocabulary and comprehension, but also learn to think critically, analyze information responsibly, and engage in global conversations with confidence. This is exactly the educational approach we aim for here on the English Globe, helping learners grow linguistically and intellectually through thoughtful discussion of important topics.
As we move toward the end of our discussion, it is essential to remind listeners that one of the main purposes of this podcast is to help you learn English through real-world news. Listening to complex topics, such as the Epstein Files, can feel intimidating at first, but it is a powerful way to expand vocabulary and improve comprehension. When we discuss legal documents, court processes, and transparency, learners are exposed to language that is precise, formal, and widely used in news reporting. This type of listening practice helps build confidence in understanding serious content while learning English naturally.
Yes, Adam. For many learners, hearing words like evidence, allegation, document, or transparency repeatedly in context is far more effective than memorizing them from a list. Understanding these terms in real-life discussions teaches not only vocabulary, but also nuance, tone, and usage. By practicing active listening, learners can distinguish between factual statements, procedural language, and opinion. This skill is essential for reading and listening comprehension, and it also empowers learners to discuss serious topics in English without feeling overwhelmed.
It is also important to practice active listening, which means paying attention to the meaning behind words, the connections between ideas, and the context in which vocabulary appears. For example, when we use the term court document, it is not just a piece of paper. It represents an official record, a step in a legal process, and evidence that can be examined and interpreted. Understanding the multiple layers of meaning behind these words develops critical thinking while reinforcing English comprehension. Active listening also prepares learners to read news articles with greater clarity and accuracy.
Exactly, Adam. Many learners feel anxious when approaching complex topics because they fear the vocabulary or ideas will be too difficult. By listening slowly, repeating challenging words, and following the dialogue step by step, learners can reduce this fear. Words that at first seem complicated, like accountability, procedure, or transparency, become familiar over time through repeated exposure. This method also strengthens pronunciation, context understanding, and memory, making English learning both practical and engaging.
Another benefit of listening to serious news topics is that it helps learners recognize patterns in formal English. Legal and news language often uses precise structures, cautious phrasing, and conditional statements. For example, phrases like, according to the documents, it is alleged that, or the court considered, are used consistently in reporting to indicate careful reasoning. By hearing these patterns repeatedly, learners internalize them and can apply them in writing, speaking, and understanding English in other professional or academic contexts.
Yes, and this also encourages learners to be confident when discussing difficult subjects. Learning English through news like this allows listeners to see that complex topics can be understood step by step. It reduces anxiety because the focus is not on memorizing everything at once, but on following meaning, noticing repeated vocabulary, and connecting ideas logically. Over time, learners gain the confidence to read news articles, watch educational videos, and participate in discussions without feeling lost or intimidated by language or content.
It is also useful to note that listening to complex topics enhances critical thinking in English. When learners hear us explain the difference between names mentioned in documents and proven facts, or the difference between online claims and legal reality, they are practicing interpretation skills while expanding vocabulary. Words like legal, court, document, evidence, and transparency are more meaningful when connected to concepts that matter globally. This integration of language and knowledge allows learners to see practical applications of English in understanding the world.
Absolutely, Adam. And learners can also practice summarizing information in their own words. After listening to this podcast, you might try explaining what a court document or evidence means in simple English, or describing the role of transparency in legal systems. These exercises help reinforce comprehension, vocabulary, and grammar. They also develop confidence in producing English rather than just recognizing it, which is a key step for anyone looking to improve speaking and writing skills through real-world content.
Another tip for learners is to pause and reflect on new words or expressions. For example, when we discuss accountability, it is helpful to think of its meaning in a sentence. Transparency ensures accountability in legal systems. By practicing sentences like this, learners can internalize vocabulary and improve sentence structure simultaneously. Listening to explanations in dialogue form, as we provide here, gives learners both the words and the context, which is far more effective than memorizing definitions alone.
Yes, Adam. And one more thing. Learners should remember that learning through complex news also builds listening stamina. Topics like this are long and detailed, and following them trains the brain to process English more efficiently. The more you listen, the more you notice patterns, repeated vocabulary, and grammatical structures. This not only helps with understanding serious topics, but also prepares learners to handle conversations, lectures, or news reports in English across many different subjects confidently.
Finally, it is essential to embrace challenges when learning English through real-world news. Difficult topics, formal language, and long discussions might feel overwhelming initially, but with patience and repetition, learners will gain both understanding and confidence. This podcast, by explaining legal processes, transparency, and media literacy, gives listeners repeated exposure to key vocabulary and concepts. Each section allows learners to practice comprehension, note-taking, and critical thinking while improving English in a meaningful, practical context.
Exactly, Adam. To encourage all our listeners, remember that learning English through complex topics is not about immediate mastery. It is about gradual understanding and confidence building. By listening attentively, repeating key terms, and reflecting on their meaning, learners develop a strong foundation. This approach helps reduce fear, encourages curiosity, and demonstrates that even challenging subjects can become accessible and useful for both language skills and global knowledge.
So, dear listeners, our goal here is to show that serious news is not intimidating. It is a tool for learning English while engaging with the world responsibly. By focusing on vocabulary such as legal, court, document, evidence, and transparency, and by practicing active listening, you can develop both language skills and critical thinking. English learners gain not only words, but also understanding of global issues, careful reasoning, and confidence in engaging with complex information safely and thoughtfully.
Yes, Adam. And finally, we encourage learners to enjoy the process. Every new word, concept, or idea you encounter in discussions like this strengthens both English and your understanding of the world. Remember to pause, reflect, and connect vocabulary to ideas, and soon even the most challenging topics will feel manageable. Learning through real-world news is not only educational, but also empowering, giving you the tools to engage with language and global knowledge with confidence here on the English globe.
As we reach the final section of today's podcast, it is important to calmly review what we have covered, because this episode was designed not only to explain a complex global topic, but also to help you improve your English listening and comprehension skills. We began by introducing the Epstein Files, explaining what they are, why they became public, and why people around the world are interested in understanding them. Our goal throughout has been to provide clear, factual information without sensationalism, emphasizing context, documents, and transparency.
Yes, Adam. And for our English learners, this review is a perfect opportunity to reinforce the vocabulary and concepts we have discussed. Words like legal, court, document, evidence, transparency, and accountability have appeared repeatedly, and hearing them in context helps learners understand their meaning and usage. We have also explored the difference between allegations, testimony, and proven facts, which is essential for reading and listening to news critically. Remember, understanding these distinctions is a skill that improves with practice and patience.
Exactly, Julia. We also discussed how media coverage can influence public perception. Some outlets present careful, responsible reporting that explains context and cites sources, while others may use sensational headlines or highlight dramatic aspects without full explanation. Learning to distinguish between these approaches helps listeners develop critical thinking skills and strengthens English comprehension. Observing tone, word choice, and phrasing allows learners to understand not only the facts, but also how information is communicated professionally.
And Adam, we emphasize that online speculation and rapid social media posts often differ from verified legal information. Court rulings are slow because evidence must be reviewed, testimony must be verified, and procedural fairness must be maintained. Learners have seen how names mentioned in documents do not automatically indicate guilt, and how cautious language in legal and journalistic contexts serves a vital purpose. Understanding these distinctions builds both language skills and responsible media literacy, allowing learners to engage thoughtfully with news.
We also explored why transparency matters globally. Legal systems, accountability mechanisms, and open access to information are central to public trust. Observers worldwide follow high-profile cases like the Epstein Files not for sensationalism, but to understand how fairness, procedure, and evidence-based decisions are maintained. By examining these principles, listeners gain insight into broader civic and societal structures while practicing English in a meaningful, real-world context. This dual purpose, learning language and understanding global themes, has been central to this episode.
Yes, Adam. For learners, connecting language to real-world concepts like justice, accountability, and transparency is highly motivating. Discussing these topics repeatedly reinforces vocabulary, comprehension, and confidence. We have also encouraged active listening skills, critical reading, and calm evaluation of complex news. Every time learners reflect on key concepts and vocabulary, they are strengthening their English while simultaneously building a framework for analyzing serious global events in a responsible way.
We also highlighted media literacy as a key skill. Comparing responsible reporting with emotional or sensationalized reporting allows learners to understand how information is framed, why context is critical, and how to evaluate sources carefully. This skill is not just for understanding English. It is a life skill that helps learners navigate complex news safely, reduce misunderstandings, and participate in discussions with confidence. Our episode has shown how language and global awareness work together to enhance both learning and comprehension.
And Adam, we reminded learners that challenging topics do not need to be intimidating. Words that seem complex like procedural, allegation, or oversight become more approachable when used repeatedly in context. Listening, reflecting, and connecting vocabulary to meaning allows learners to gain confidence and fluency. By practicing patience and critical thinking while following our discussion, learners are developing the ability to approach English news articles, podcasts, and conversations calmly, accurately, and confidently.
Finally, it is important to reinforce that this podcast is created entirely for educational purposes. The discussion of the Epstein Files, the documents, and public reactions is intended to help listeners learn English, expand vocabulary, improve listening skills, and understand legal and civic concepts safely. This content is not intended to accuse, speculate, or judge anyone. Our aim has always been to provide factual, clear, and YouTube-safe explanations so that learners can engage with serious topics responsibly and productively.
Exactly, Adam. As we close, we warmly encourage all listeners to keep practicing English through real-world topics like this. Reflect on the vocabulary, notice how sentences are structured, and try summarizing sections in your own words. Each time you do this, your comprehension and confidence grow. Remember that learning English through global news not only improves language but also develops critical thinking, civic awareness, and the ability to analyze information calmly.
So, dear listeners, to summarize one last time, we explored what the Epstein Files are, the importance of legal processes, the role of transparency and accountability, how media shapes public perception, and how to distinguish verified facts from speculation. We examined vocabulary, phrases, and patterns used in professional reporting, helping learners understand and practice English in context. Listening carefully, reflecting on meaning, and applying critical thinking are all part of developing fluency while staying informed responsibly.
Yes, and remember, learning English is a journey. Difficult topics may feel challenging at first, but repeated practice, attention to context, and understanding nuance will make even complex subjects approachable. Keep listening, reading, and reflecting. Discuss topics in English with friends or family, write summaries, and note new words. Every step strengthens your ability to engage with the world in English confidently and responsibly. Here at the English Globe, we are committed to supporting your learning journey through real-world topics safely and effectively.
Thank you, dear listeners, for staying with us through this episode. We hope this discussion has been informative, educational, and helpful for your English learning. Remember that understanding global issues while practicing language skills is a powerful combination. Stay curious, stay patient, and keep building your vocabulary, listening comprehension, and critical thinking abilities. This is exactly the approach that allows learners to connect language learning with real-world understanding.
Yes, Adam. And as we end, we warmly remind all our learners to continue practicing English every day, engaging with news, podcasts, and educational materials thoughtfully and responsibly. Your effort, reflection, and curiosity will make you a stronger English speaker, a more critical thinker, and a confident global learner. Thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to exploring more topics with you here on the English Globe. Keep learning, stay calm, and enjoy the process.